On one of the hot August days, the farmers of the small American county of Great Bend, Kansas, realized that their golden field had yielded too much gold. The wheat harvest was not just successful, it was catastrophically abundant. There had never been a harvest like this in the entire history of the county. The local grain elevators were filling up so quickly that workers could barely keep up with unloading the lines of trucks stretching for miles along the highway. One of the warehouses, built back in the late 19th century, could not withstand the pressure. Its wooden walls, once sturdy and reliable, began to creak under the pressure of tens of thousands of bushels of grain, and then finally collapsed, burying part of the harvest and a couple of tractors beneath them. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but the sight was terrifying. It was as if a golden wave had broken through a dam and spilled out onto the asphalt. This incident forced the local authorities to urgently tap into reserves, rent temporary storage facilities, and even send part of the wheat for early export to free up space. The harvest itself reached nearly 500,000 bushels a figure, more than double the standard volume of the past 20 years. Experts attributed the phenomenon to a unique combination of weather factors: a mild winter, early spring, regular rainfall, and the absence of pests. All of this together created ideal conditions for explosive crop growth. But even scientists could not have predicted such a scale. Paradoxically, the farmers actually lost part of their profits because of this bumper crop. The surplus of grain caused a sharp drop in market prices, and some farms had to sell at the lowest possible cost. Nevertheless, that year went down in local history as the Golden Crusher harvest so great that even the storage hangars couldn't handle it. But if you think that was the limit, the next harvest turned out to be a true tomato frenzy. California's San Joaquin Valley, known as America's vegetable belt, experienced something akin to a disaster movie scenario in the summer of 1997. Only instead of lava or a flood, the valley was flooded with tomatoes. The tomato harvest was so enormous that even seasoned agronomists were at a loss. It all began with an unusually mild winter and a long sunny spell that lasted more than 100 days. Farmers were anticipating a good season, but by midsummer it became clear the situation was getting out of control. The plants started bearing fruit at a frantic pace, and there were almost twice as many tomatoes per square foot as usual. The harvesters worked around the clock. Mobile crews were stationed in the fields, unloading trucks that arrived every 15 minutes. The state's canning factories switched to working without days off, but even that wasn't enough. Some farmers began storing the harvest right in the fields under tarps, trying at least somehow to preserve tons of perishable goods. Amazingly, that summer the price of tomatoes hardly changed at all. The reason was an industry that responded in time. Producers of sauces, pastes, and ketchup bought up the surplus en masse. That year, Heinz alone nearly doubled its purchases. Nevertheless, farmers remember that season as an apocalypse, exhausting, grueling, but at the same time record-breaking in terms of income. And yet, even such abundance pales in comparison to the potato harvest that literally redrew the map of the state Idaho has long been famous for its potato fields. But in the mid-2000s, farmers witnessed how a familiar crop could turn into a logistical nightmare. That year, millions of tons of potatoes were harvested in the state, and it was a record that brought the entire region's infrastructure to its knees. A farmer named Joel McKinley was the first to sound the alarm. He reported to the local Farmers Association that his fields had yielded almost twice as much as expected. In response, they just shrugged. That is, until the same report came in from 50 more farmers. It soon became clear this was a widespread phenomenon. Due to a lack of enough trucks and rail cars, part of the harvest had to be temporarily buried back in the ground or stored in hastily built mounds. Some farms even started giving potatoes away for free, just so they wouldn't rot. Producers of chips, mashed potatoes, and semi-finished products were making deals right on the spot, arriving in pickup trucks and taking away sacks of potatoes without any bureaucracy. The profit turned out to be phenomenal. Some farmers managed to earn in one season as much as they usually made in 5 years. This case became a subject of study in agricultural universities across the country. However, ahead lay a harvest whose scale literally stretched to the horizon. If you found yourself in the middle of a cornfield in Nebraska in the summer of 1999, it would seem as if you were at sea. Waves of tall stalks swayed in the wind, stretching for miles beyond the horizon. It was one of the largest corn harvests in the history of the United States. The planted area was standard, but the yield exceeded all expectations. A new hybrid variety, optimal rainfall, and minimal pests all played their part. On some farms, they harvested up to 300 bushels per acre, a figure that was considered fantastic at the time. The problem was that the corn didn't just grow, it grew too quickly. Not all farmers had managed to prepare storage facilities in advance. Once again, tents, sheds, and temporary bunkers were put to use. Many combines operated non-stop for 20 hours a day, breaking down every other day. In some areas, they even started bringing in farmers from neighboring states to help with the harvest. Agricultural analysts predicted that this crop would crash the market, but the demand for feed and ethanol absorbed most of the surplus. This saved the season, although the logistics were stretched to their limits. But even this ocean of corn can't compare to what once happened in Florida, where the roads became slippery from oranges. Florida is famous for its citrus fruits, but the winter of 2010 brought more than just a harvest, it brought an orange storm. It all began with a rainy autumn and an unusually mild winter, which awakened the trees to bloom actively earlier than usual. By February, it was already clear. The trees were covered with fruit in unprecedented quantities. When the harvest began, it turned out that in some groves there was almost twice as much fruit as in previous seasons. The crop was so dense that some trees began to break under the weight. Tractors got stuck in the mud, and transporters couldn't keep up with the flow. In some places, oranges literally spilled onto the roads, causing traffic jams and even hazardous situations. Students, volunteers, and even prisoners who were allowed to work for a symbolic wage came to help the farmers. Processing plants couldn't keep up. Juice began to accumulate in storage tanks, creating a risk of oversupply on the market. Nevertheless, nature provided a sweet bonus. The oranges turned out to be especially juicy and fragrant, which made it possible to boost exports and offset some of the losses. It was a year when citrus fruits became headline news, and farmers became the heroes of the headlines. But if you think all of this is already beyond imagination, just wait until you hear how a single rice harvest fed millions. Southern China, Sichuan province. The spring of 2003 turned out to be unusually warm, and the summer was humid and steady. It would seem like typical weather conditions for a region where rice cultivation is a long-standing tradition. But this season exceeded all expectations. Amid experiments with new drip irrigation technology and the use of disease-resistant varieties, farmers harvested a crop capable of feeding nearly half the country. There were so many sacks of rice per hectare that the old carts couldn't handle the load. They had to use construction platforms. Dozens of villages joined forces to organize collective harvesting and logistics. The product was supplied not only to the domestic market, but was also massively exported to Southeast Asian countries, driving down prices and causing a real rice panic among competitors. China's Ministry of Agriculture called this achievement a revolution on water. It was not just about volume, but about efficiency. They managed to achieve record yields without expanding the sown areas. This strategy was soon adopted as the basis for the National Food Security Program. But, as always, a large quantity of product is not always a blessing. The surplus supply led to overstocking, and some of the rice had to be processed into animal feed. Despite this, the very fact of such a harvest became a source of national pride. Then, the attention of the whole world shifted to a continent on the opposite side of the globe, where wheat grew sky high. The Australian state of New South Wales found itself at the epicenter of a remarkable weather phenomenon in the early 2000s. After several years of drought, the region finally received abundant but moderate rains, and the soil, saturated with moisture, produced an unprecedented surge in yields. Farmers who had sown wheat on a gamble suddenly found themselves owners of gold mines. The harvest was so massive that local ports couldn't keep up with shipping wheat to Asia and the Middle East. Ships lined up off the coast waiting to be loaded, while grain elevators in the cities were already overflowing by the middle of the harvest. The Australian government even temporarily lifted some export restrictions to prevent a collapse in domestic prices. The wheat was shipped to more than 20 countries. Farmers, many of whom had previously been on the verge of bankruptcy, were able to pay off their debts and invest in new equipment. This wave of wheat strengthened Australia's position in the global grain market. Amazingly, even decades later, this season is still called the continent's harvest miracle. But while Australia was strengthening its position in wheat, Chile set its own fruit record. The central part of Chile in the 2000s became the stage for a unique harvest boom. Peaches, nectarines, apricots, everything was literally falling off the trees. This was the result of a years-long breeding program into which the country had invested millions of dollars. And finally, everything worked out. The fruit trees produced such a harvest that the usual storage crates proved useless. Fish containers, construction bins, and even old trucks were used. The temperature was perfect, there was just the right amount of rainfall, and there were practically no pests. Chile exported fruit to the USA, Canada, Japan, and Europe. Nectarines were especially in demand, quickly earning champion status on the market due to their high sugar content. Thousands of seasonal workers were brought in to process the harvest. Temporary settlements sprang up right next to the orchards. As a result, Chile doubled its share of the global stone fruit market. But, as often happens, after fruit came beans, and not just any beans, but on such a scale that they were included in Brazil's national reports. In the early 2000s, central Brazil experienced a true soybean boom. Huge agro-industrial complexes, established on former pastures, produced a harvest in just one season that placed the country among the top 3 global leaders in soybean production. The grain was exported to China, Indonesia, and Europe. Environmental trends fueled the demand. Soybeans were actively replacing meat in food products, and Brazil found itself in the right place at the right time. The harvest amounted to millions of tons, and every day hundreds of railcars left the region, heading to the ports of Santos and Paranaguá. One of the farmers, Marcus Teves, harvested so much that he had to store the crop on a football field. His story made national news and turned him into the hero of the week. The government quickly stepped in to support the infrastructure so as not to let the export machine come to a halt. This soybean fever brought Brazil not only billions but also political influence in food security negotiations. But the next harvest was different. It was rare, aromatic, and was gathered almost by hand in the very heart of Italy. In the Piedmont region of northern Italy, the year 2007 was magical. Nature provided perfect conditions for the growth of the white truffle, the most expensive delicacy in the world. Usually it is found only in single specimens, but that year something incredible happened. The harvest was almost 4 times higher than normal. Local truffle hunters with their dogs went out searching every day and came back with baskets that used to take a week to fill. Some of the truffles weighed more than a pound, a rarity even by global standards. Prices began to fall, but demand remained consistently high. Restaurants around the world held truffle festivals. One of the most expensive sales of that season, a truffle weighing almost 2 pounds, was sold to Hong Kong for an amount comparable to the price of an apartment. The harvest was so abundant that many restaurants, which usually used truffle shavings, began adding it generously for the first time, creating new dishes and traditions. Italy earned tens of millions of dollars in just a few months. And as fragrant as that season was, the next harvest was so remarkable that it was even noted in aviation reports. Western Canada doesn't often make global headlines when it comes to record harvests. But one day everything changed. The 2011 season became a real breakthrough for oats. The provinces of Manitoba and Saskatchewan produced such a volume of grain that even veteran farmers were scratching their heads in amazement. Oats, unlike more profitable crops, rarely become the focus of news stories. But that year, the weather conditions were so favorable that the plants practically shot up. The rains came exactly at the key stages of growth, and the sun finished the process with perfect ripening. Yields doubled. Some farmers harvested more than 200 bushels per acre, a figure unheard of for the region. Feed warehouses filled up within just a few weeks. Muesli and horse feed producers, especially in the United States, began buying up the grain in advance even before the harvest was finished. Oats became the export hit of the season, unexpectedly bringing Canada millions of extra dollars. The case became an example of how an obscure culture can suddenly become a star in the global market. While Canadians were enjoying their grain success, a real banana storm was brewing in Ecuador. Ecuador is one of the largest banana exporters in the world, but the spring of 2005 was an exception even by their standards. A wave of unusual rains, accompanied by steady temperatures, triggered a real explosion on the plantations. Bananas were growing at a crazy rate and in such quantities that the plantations had to be harvested twice as often. On the Guayaquil coast, shipments were being sent to the ports around the clock. Companies rented additional ships to keep up with exporting the fruit. Workers labored in shifts, not leaving the fields even at night. The fruit literally didn't have time to fully ripen. Demand exceeded supply, despite the volumes. At the same time, quality improved. The bananas were firm, uniform, and a perfect yellow color. Marketers even dubbed them the premium harvest of the decade. American and European supermarket chains engaged in a real price war over them. Nevertheless, oversaturation occurred. The consequences were serious. Many plantation owners were forced to send the surplus for processing or feed it to livestock. And yet, this harvest became a source of national pride and a subject of study in agricultural economics. The next harvest was no less impressive. Only this time, instead of bananas, beans and politics took center stage. Argentina, known for its meat, unexpectedly came to the forefront in another category in the 2000s: legumes, particularly beans and soybeans. In one season, with government support and subsidies, the country achieved a harvest comparable in significance to its famous beef exports. Beans were cultivated on previously unused lands. Thanks to the introduction of drip irrigation and a satellite monitoring system, record yields were achieved over 50 million sacks, each weighing 100 pounds. The country exported legumes to more than 40 countries around the world. Economists called that season vegetarian oil. The income from beans exceeded the income from several other agricultural sectors combined. This success allowed Argentina to strengthen its foreign economic position and invest in infrastructure. However, there was a downside: a drop in prices on the domestic market and conflict with farmers who did not receive the expected profits. Even so, the harvest went down in history as one of the largest in the southern hemisphere. While Argentina was arguing about money, on the other side of the world, trees were literally weeping from an excess of oil. In Indonesia, whose palm oil feeds entire industries from food to cosmetics, there was once a season that nearly paralyzed the country's domestic capacities. The oil palm harvest in Riau province was so abundant that the trees began dropping their fruit prematurely simply from the weight. The farmers were unprepared. Harvesting usually takes weeks, but now everything was happening in just a matter of days. The fruit began to spoil right on the spot. The oil processing plants were working to the limit, and even so, they couldn't keep up. Trucks stood in kilometer-long lines. Oil was poured into reservoirs and even into makeshift plastic lakes. On the global market, palm oil prices plummeted, causing discontent among producers from Malaysia and Africa. And yet, despite all the difficulties, Indonesia's exports reached a historic record. It was both a triumph and a lesson. Nature can be generous, but you have to be prepared for its gifts. The next phenomenon was just as large scale, but in a completely different climate under apple-filled clouds. In the autumn of 2008, Central and Eastern Europe were enveloped in the scent of apples. Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, all these countries experienced simultaneously perfect weather conditions, which led to a phenomenal harvest. Apples were everywhere. Polish farmers, the leaders of the European apple market, found that their cold storage facilities were already overflowing by September. Apples began to be stored in schools, gymnasiums, and even covered markets. Exports reached record highs. The fruit was shipped to Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. But with this came problems. Prices collapsed. Small farmers were losing profits, while retailers were cashing in on the scale. Against this backdrop, protests even began in Poland. Fruit was given away for free in public squares to demonstrate the scale of the crisis. Nevertheless, the harvest was the largest in EU history. Millions of tons of apples became a symbol of abundance and a reminder that success can be bittersweet. And then came the heat, monsoons, and giant mangoes that appeared seemingly out of nowhere. The summer of 2009. In India, it began with anxiety. The monsoons were delayed, and the heat was relentless. But when the rains finally arrived, they poured down on the subcontinent with such precision, it was as if someone had dumped them right over the mango orchards. As a result, something happened that even the village elders hadn't expected: the mango boom of the century. The Uttar Pradesh region, especially the Malihabad district, produced a harvest so abundant that locals began to compare it to a mango flood. The fruits were large, rich, and exceptionally sweet. The yield was so high that harvesting was done in 3 shifts, including at night. For the first time in many decades, the army had to be brought in to guard the orchards against mass theft. Mangoes filled store shelves across the entire country. Exports to the Persian Gulf countries and Europe reached historic highs. It seemed as if the whole country was living under the sign of the mango. Festivals, fairs, and competitions for the best jamal of it revolved around this harvest. And yet, the surplus of fruit led to a sharp drop in prices. Mangoes became so affordable that in some regions they were even added to animal feed. But India still remembers that year as the sweet rain. To this day, that summer is considered the benchmark. While India was awash in mangoes, Greece was swimming in a sea of olive oil. In 2004, the olive groves of the Peloponnese experienced a magical season. The rains came just as much as needed. There was plenty of heat, but not excessively so. And the wind blowing in from the Aegean Sea dried the leaves and protected the fruit from mold. All of this led to a harvest the country hadn't seen in over 100 years. The olives were large, fleshy, and incredibly fragrant. They were pressed into extra virgin oil in such quantities that the pressing lines operated around the clock. In some places there was nowhere left to store it. They had to urgently purchase additional barrels and tankers. Oil exports more than doubled. Greece edged out Italy and Spain in several markets. Shipments were sent to the USA, Canada, and the Middle East. National television broadcast daily reports from the olive groves. Everything felt like a real celebration. But along with the joy came logistical problems. Several farmers, unable to harvest in time, lost hundreds of liters of oil that oxidized in the heat. Nevertheless, the season became legendary, a symbol of how nature can reward you if you treat it with patience and respect. Meanwhile, in the north of France, wine barrels were bursting from abundance. Burgundy, France, the autumn of 2012 turned out to be magical. The vineyards of the region, renowned for their elegant varieties, produced a harvest that set records not only in quantity but also in quality. The grape clusters were so dense that by the end of the first week of picking, the vintners were already complaining of tired hands. The harvest went on without pause and lasted nearly a month. Even the oldest producers, whose wineries had been in the family for 10 generations, said, "Nothing like this had happened since the time of Napoleon." The wine from that harvest became one of the best-selling in the world. The amount of wine produced that season made it possible to lower prices and make French wines accessible to new markets. Even wine critics, who are usually reserved, were impressed by the structure and aroma of the bottles from 2012. But, as often happens, not everyone managed to react in time. In several villages, the cellars were overflowing, barrels began to leak, and wine flowed through the streets. This grape flood became the final straw in a season that went down in legend. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, the harvest was already underway and it had caught the attention of the bees. Ukraine, famous for its black soil, once experienced a sunflower crop so vast it could be seen even from space. The 2016 season became epic. Sunflowers covered more than 5 million acres and each one produced a record number of seeds. The harvest went on for months. Oil processing plants couldn't keep up and the fields looked like giant yellow carpets. But beekeepers were especially delighted. The abundance of blooming fields created the perfect environment for bees. Honey production that year broke all records, and Ukrainian sunflower honey began to edge out Chinese and Argentine honey on the world market. The harvest also affected oil exports. Ukraine became the world's leading exporter, but abundance brought its own problems. Many farmers were unable to sell their seeds in time, and storage turned into a logistical nightmare. Nevertheless, for the whole country, it became a symbol of fertility and strength. And the following case showed that even a surplus can lead to falling prices. Sometimes a massive harvest is not a triumph, but a trap. That's exactly what happened in several countries at once, including the USA, India, and China. For several years in a row, the climate was exceptionally favorable. No droughts, no frosts, no diseases. As a result, everything from corn to fruit produced more than was needed. There weren't enough warehouses, processing couldn't keep up, and the ports were overloaded. A wave of food surplus swept over the world. At first glance, it seemed like a cause for celebration, but within a month, losses began. Prices for fruit, vegetables, grain, and even meat plummeted sharply. Producers started losing money, some lost millions. This phenomenon was called the harvest paradox. When nature gives too much, the economy can't adapt in time. Farmers from the wealthiest countries found themselves facing a dilemma. Should they rejoice at the abundance or fear new losses? In this story, we saw that a massive harvest can be a miracle or a challenge. But one thing remains unchanged. Behind every bushel, behind every ton, there is hard work, the weather, and a bit of luck.